go ahead and get started because there is a lot to talk about. The Inflation Reduction Act is a huge bill, and we're not going to do it full justice, but we're going to try and give a really good overview to inform how everyone can really think about this. And I'd like to give a special thanks to April Salas, Executive Director of the Rever Center and Interim Director of the Irving Institute, who really helped put this event on. So the way that this is going to go is we're going to give a brief overview of kind of the high-level framing of what's in the Inflation Reduction Act, specifically the climate-related elements. And then we're going to have our very exciting and distinguished panelists give some of their perspectives about it and some questions that we'll facilitate and ask about that. And then we'll have some time for some audience Q&A, and it should be a good opportunity. So starting off with that framing piece of it, we're just going to go over what is actually in the climate piece of the Inflation Reduction Act. The way that we are really kind of trying to frame this is that there's really three key elements. First part is this is a huge stimulus package. It's not a carbon tax, it's not a cap and trade policy, which had been talked about in the past. This is really a direct stimulus package that uses a very broad array of incentive mechanisms, from tax credits, grants, loan authorities, rebates, other incentives, other subsidies, setting up a clean energy accelerator, which is basically a green bank, lease sales, lots and lots of stuff totaling about $369 billion of stimulus. The other part is that this is really a huge industrial policy initiative. So I think a very key focus of this bill was that it is trying to bring in domestic manufacturing to drive down costs of these emerging technologies, which are really crucial to dealing with climate change and accelerating the energy transition. And so I think this is a departure from more market-based policies and before, and is now really directly trying to drive adoption to take advantage of learning rates. And we'll talk about that in a second. And then the other piece, which there's lots to talk about, is the equity piece of this. I think a huge initiative here was to make sure that the incentives were structured in a way so it supports a just transition. I think a big part of that can be seen in the energy community provisions, which means that for you to get credits, there's often a bonus or a multiplier effect if you meet certain labor standards, and then if you do certain projects in areas that have been hurt by pollution, which typically are tribal or minority communities. So digging into a little bit more detail, let's go in an overview of what that $369 billion of spending goes into. And this is very simplified, but just to make a broad painting of the picture. The biggest chunk, each of these blocks is about $1 billion, is renewables, so wind, solar, and storage. And these are mostly tax credits done over a 10-year period, so there's a lot of certainty to help businesses plan. The next big chunk is advanced manufacturing. This is really crucial to that industrial policy piece. And then there's a lot of subsidy for nuclear, which is interesting and different, as it historically has not been seen as a renewable technology, but is increasingly seen as important to carbon-free power to help the entire energy transition. And then there's a lot of new and exciting stuff in home energy, home efficiency, and electric vehicles, which is more the consumer and commercial side of technology usage. And then there's a whole bunch of stuff that is way too complicated to talk about, but is very interesting. Now, I think going back to that industrial policy piece, the real thing that is happening here is this green curve is basically adoption of different technologies. For a lot of these technologies, they're really at the low stage of adoption. So this is trying to subsidize that early adoption. And the goal is that it's going to drop the technology cost over this period so that the market takes it from there and kind of kicks it forward. And a way to see that is what this is projected to do on costs of different technologies. So for electric vehicles, where gray is before the IRA, green is afterwards, you can see pretty significant decreases as a result of this credit. You also see that in a big way in terms of battery manufacturing in the US. You also see that with heat pumps. You see that with industrial carbon capture and sequestration. You see that with hydrogen, and then you see that with direct air capture. It pushes a lot of these technologies close to being economical or right over the line of being economical for current adoption because of these stimulus packages. And so what's that projected to do? is really increase investment. And what we're showing you is from Professor Erin Mayfield's research that she does with Jesse Jenkins at Princeton University. She's a Thayer professor here who's really an expert at climate modeling and the intersection with technology and commercial adoption. And so we're using a lot of her reports here. And what you can see is in that left panel is what if the Inflation Reduction Act didn't happen. In the right panel, what happens because of the act. You see a huge increase in the investment in later years, particularly in wind and solar, in some of the CCS technologies, and some of those technologies which had probably no investment going into them, like hydrogen. At the later end, there's now potential that there is a significant amount of investment going there. And so ultimately, what does that mean for climate change, since I think that's what a lot of us care about here? This is showing the annual greenhouse gas equivalent emissions for the US, where 2005 was when we hit peak emissions, and you can see that red line is kind of the forecast of what if we didn't do anything different than business as usual. And it's showing that compared to the gray line, which is our target we agreed to in Paris, we're way above it. Now that purple line is what we're projected to do as a result of the Inflation Reduction Act. So you see a huge drop in that reduction is projected now, which is really important for us doing our part to deal with climate change. So numbers, just to put context behind it. By 2030, this would be about 1 billion metric tons of greenhouse gas equivalent less per year, which is basically closing that gap by about 2/3 just by passing this act, and a cumulative effect by that point in time of about 6 billion metric tons. So these are kind of unimaginably large numbers, but you can see how big of a deal this potentially can be. And then, just for a little bit more context on where those reductions are coming from, a lot of it's coming from transportation and power in these early years, but you see things like industry as well as buildings really starting to take off more, which historically have been a little slower to be a contributor to the reduction of emissions. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Nate to introduce our panel.
Great, thanks, John. Excellent, can everyone hear me okay? Super. Also, just a quick introduction. My name is Nate Rowe. I am a senior here at Dartmouth, an undergrad studying electrical engineering, and part of my ribbon of energy on this Dartmouth campus is co-leading the undergraduate energy club. And yeah, I think that as a learning opportunity, this panel for any undergrads in the room is a great way to break into energy if you haven't already at Dartmouth. And without further ado, I'll get started with some introductions. So to lead us off here, Dean Alexis Abramson. Alexis Abramson is the 13th Dean of the Thayer School here at Dartmouth. Dean Abramson served as Chief Scientist and Manager of the Emerging Technologies Division at the U.S. Department of Energy's Building Technologies Program. Dean Abramson has also authored more than 60 peer-reviewed publications. Next, we have Professor Sundaram. Professor Sundaram is a clinical professor at the Tuck School of Business, where his areas of expertise are business valuation, mergers and acquisitions, corporate governance, and financial strategies for profitable growth. Additionally, Professor Sundaram teaches a popular class on business and climate change and is currently developing a handbook of business and climate change. Next, we have Professor Erich Osterberg, an associate professor of earth sciences at Dartmouth, where his research focuses on understanding how and why climate has changed, and his research also identifies trends and sources of air pollution. Finally, we have Professor Keller. Professor Keller is a Hodgson Distinguished Professor of Engineering at the Thayer School. His research focuses on how we can understand past and potentially predict future changes in the Earth system, and how we can use this information to design sustainable, feasible, efficient, and ethical risk management strategies. Professor Keller has contributed to reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and published more than 130 peer-reviewed studies. Maybe I'll just take a second to let the panelists speak for themselves if I missed anything in their introductions. Otherwise, we can get right into some questions. Super. So maybe to kick things off on a light note, for each of the panelists, it would be great to hear one or two things that you're most excited about baked into the Inflation Reduction Act. Yeah, I guess in any particular order, but feel free to pass the mic.
We have one mic. Let's see. Is that on? Doesn't sound like it's
Louder.
Louder. Okay, how about now?
Yeah.
We're good. Okay, great, thank you. How many engineers does it take? Let's see, so two things, is that what I get? Okay, yeah.
There'll be more
All right,
questions.
I'll do two. I think, you know, first of all, thank you to both of you and to the Irving Institute for putting this together, right? It's really important that as we think about the real impact that this new act will have on our country, and very much in a positive way. I'm very optimistic in that way, that we all sort of understand this to some extent, maybe not all the gritty details, but John, that was a great presentation, so thank you for helping educate us a little bit more about some of those details. I think one thing I would say is, what I think gets lost sometimes, and it's great to see this in the act, is that sort of there are kind of three sort of main solution categories that we need to think about, and we see them addressed, all three of them, in the act to fund those investments to move this forward. So the first one, everybody goes to wind and solar. Well, is wind and solar just the solution? So, and renewables, obviously wind and solar are amazing, you know, carbon-free essentially solution that is important to see in there, and the funding for that being large, as we saw there. The other one would be the problem with wind and solar and how we're addressing that is that it's intermittent, right? The sun doesn't shine all the time, the wind doesn't blow all the time, we need batteries. We would need a whole lot of batteries if all we could rely on was wind and solar to provide the sort of constant or firm electricity to us, right? The resistors at the end of the wire, the buildings and other aspects of energy use that we use. So it's great to see that in addition, we're thinking about other sort of more constantly delivering energy sources, right? And so that's is certainly more nuclear and then other advanced geothermal, maybe even biomass, biofuels, things that can provide us more constant energy sources. So great to see attention given to that as well. And then the third piece, which tends to be my more favorite piece, is this more this sort of short bursts of need that we have, the peak operation need that we have, right? When it's July 15th, a hot summer day, and it was kind of cool in the morning, and but by 3 p.m., you know, it's 95 degrees in Hanover, right? And do we build a grid that's big enough to handle that, or are there other sort of smart, intelligent kind of ways that we can adjust and shift, load shift, and do other things to be able to account for that? So it's great to see more attention to that, and both on the R&D side, but also on the application side. And then probably the other thing that I'm kind of required to say, because I work in the building efficiency space, is it's great to see buildings get a lot of attention, as John alluded to. They don't get a lot of attention usually. They are kind of, people think of them as resistors at the end of this wire of the grid, you know, a lot of them. But they're very dynamic, they can be very intelligent, and so it's great to see a lot more attention paid to them. And a lot of money in some cases for an energy efficient appliance. If you meet the income requirements, you can get 100% of that energy efficient appliance paid for. So everything from heat pumps to windows to insulation, rebate programs to help buy induction stoves and heat pump water heaters, electric heat pumps moving from fossil fuel-based heating and cooling, right? But fossil fuel-based heating in particular to be able to do cold climate heat pumps. So it's just great to see the motivator for that, and I'm looking forward to all that happens as a result. So.
Okay, tough act to follow. From my perspective, and to augment on the previous statement, I am really excited about that we get going. Because in the past, we were talked about it, we wrote papers, and wouldn't it be nice to, now we say, okay, it's the law of the land, we have money for it, let's get going. I think that's just it's a transition from, let's get serious, that's point one. Point two, and then that's not really engineering, but I think it's really interesting from my point of view that when you read the act, and this is a somewhat long act to read, I was really surprised how careful this is designed to be passable and to be almost work in the system. Federal Tax Act is one thing, and other places, other actors cannot really resist, and then the block grants is another institution. So there are pros and cons, but what we get is the kind of the product of sausage making, and sometimes it's not really nice what goes in, but the sausage hopefully is still, if you're this kind of inclined, and something which is useful. So what we see here is really an interesting way how we can break the hindrance and the logjam to actually get going. And so I think there will be interesting questions about the dynamics economically, politically, legally, for us to get going, because it's one thing to say, let's get going, there's money, it's another to implement something which makes sense and efficient. And just it's nice to look at projections, but one projection in a model which assumes efficiency and we all get along is one thing, what happens in reality is maybe quite another. And the third aspect, which I find interesting, is the focus on equity or the lack thereof, which is a start. And I have more to say about this afterwards maybe, but I think with praise comes also maybe questions about could we improve on that, because I think the way this is done right now is somewhat, but maybe this is the product of how it has to be done to be passable in the system. But I do think that this is something where maybe it's the role of academia to help us think this through more carefully. How do we define equity? How do we measure equity? How do we operationalize it? Are there trade-offs? Are there synergies? And how do we implement technical systems that we actually be efficient but also equitable? So those are the three most exciting parts.
Thanks, Klaus. So I'm going to take a slightly more 30,000 foot view here, sort of building on Klaus like we started. Congress passed a climate bill. Congress passed a climate bill, right? And it didn't look like they were gonna. Build Back Better fell on its face. We had Democrats controlling both houses of Congress and the presidency. If it didn't happen now, when was it going to happen, right? And it didn't look like it was going to happen. And then one day in August, you wake up and what? It happened. I'm just, as a climate scientist with kids, just looking at this and seeing that gap that we made up, I'm so excited. This is the start. It's not everything we need, obviously, but it's a huge start. When's the last time you were excited about something Congress did, right? I'm actually personally excited. I started thinking about, these rebates, you're talking about the heat pumps.
Yep.
I'm going to go heat pump, and I'm okay, 2023, I'm lining up my installers, right? I can actually personally benefit from this, not just sort of the global climate interest that I have. So I'm really excited. In terms of the details, I guess two things that stood out to me that I was pleased to see. One was the nuclear that you mentioned. Not so much growing. I personally would like to see growth, but to at least maintain. That's 20% of our electricity. If we lose that, that's a huge problem. So to maintain the nuclear, and I was also pleasantly surprised to see the amount of money put in for carbon capture and sequestration, which 20 years ago sort of seemed like pie in the sky kind of stuff. Now every IPCC report's we need to do this if we're going to meet these targets, and to finally see some real investment behind that to try and make these cost effective, I was really excited to see that. The wind and solar, that's the kind of stuff you'd expect, really excited to see that too, but the nuclear and the CCS were two things that kind of stood out to me.
Thanks. I'll also talk about three things, and I'm going to bring us down more to 3,000 rather than 30,000, from 30,000 feet. I'll echo the points that Alexis and Erich made about I think Alexis characterized it well, a sort of shift in focus from intermittent sources to making things more 24/7 kind of energy sources, whether it's a tremendous amount of money or subsidies being made available for storage technologies, especially growth in US manufacturing and mining related to that, carbon capture, sequestration, finding alternative uses, industrial energy efficiency, home energy efficiency, sustainable aviation fuels, biofuels more generally, and there's a whole list of things that I think that these industries could get a good kickstart relative to the kinds of industries that have been favored in the past 20 years of sort of random climate policy that we've had. And so that to me is a great thing. Point number 2, that actually I think is an important one, and which will enhance the likelihood of success of especially many of the energy efficiency and home, etc. investments in mitigation technologies, is, now this might sound very wonky and down to earth, there's something called direct pay that has become a part of the whole thing that's huge. Because, so for a non-profit, say Dartmouth wants to install solar panels or energy efficiency, make energy efficiency investment, geothermal, which the college is thinking of, etc. Traditionally, what you'd have to do is go find a third party to say, hey, I can't use a 30% tax advantage, the tax credit that I'm going to get since I'm a non-profit. I'd have to go to essentially a broker who sells that on my behalf, take a huge discount. Now, if Dartmouth makes an investment, if a non-profit that I sit on the board of makes an investment, the government just sends them a 30% check. That really makes the whole, that's a huge direct subsidy that makes things more efficient. So, I mean, it sounds a little wonky, but I think it's going to be an important fillip to getting investments going. The third one is not what excites me the most, but this is a carbon reduction party for businesses. Let me explain. And this is a hugely important point of view. I might glaze over, but please bear with me. Let's go back to the numbers that John put up. There are 3 groups. Princeton, another group called Rhodium, which John mentioned too in one of his footnotes. There's one other group I'm blanking the names on. They've all done projections of what the carbon savings expected by 2030, 2031 will be with this. But you have to be careful. So, for example, the blurb said, oh yeah, there'll be 40% reduction, and even one of the slides that John showed, 42% reduction. But that is in the aggregate. You always have to look at what extra would this act bring, which is ideally relative to business as usual or reference case scenario. And if you look at the US forecasts, the EPA, etc., forecasts of this, on a business as usual basis, we are on target to get to somewhere between a low case of 24% reduction to a high case of 31% reduction by 2030. And what the Act will do is make that, according to, if you take the average of those 3 studies, make it more like 31% to 41%. And now, here is where, if you get, look at the facts, that is, even if you say, the low end, 7% gain, high end 10% gain from the Act, the US emits about 6 billion metric tons. So that's about 400 to 600 million tons in extra reduction. That differs from the billion number that the Princeton study that John put out, but according to numbers I've looked at, it's more like, on average, maybe 500 million. The reason I bring this up is we are spending about $350 to $400 billion on this. Let's make a simple assumption that we spend all of it today, and 2, let's be hugely optimistic and say we get all of that $500 million in carbon benefits starting today to forever. Everybody with me? So we also then have to take that, let's say, 375 billion that we've spent, and then look at it as a perpetuity. In other words, how much on average would we spend? Incidentally, Professor Hansen sitting here, Tech Professor, and I bounced it off him, and I think my numbers are okay. Bottom line is, it's equal to spending about 38 billion per year forever to get about $500 million in reductions. Divide $37.5 billion by roughly $500 million in reductions, that is about a $75 per ton implied cost of carbon in that. Now, why is that important? People would argue that the marginal abatement cost of carbon for a typical company today in the US, and the numbers vary, but it's more like in the $50 range. So bottom line, they're getting a huge subsidy. I have a feeling what we're going to find is companies climbing over each other to, and which in turn raises another thing when we come back to the discussion. Let me stop here. But I also wonder about the monitoring, verification, follow-ups on this. There's nothing in the Act that mentions that. A lot of money could get wasted.
Awesome, thank you all. We're gonna kind of ask some more focused questions now on technology, environment, and business, and kind of how those can pertain to students when they're thinking about what type of research topics, what type of career paths, what type of educational opportunities they should pursue while they're here. And so just starting on the technology point to Dean Abramson, I think one of the interesting things is if we see this big uptake in grants and subsidies going into R&D, do we have the engineers and scientists ready to go? And if we don't, how should students be thinking about what they can do to kind of take advantage of that exciting opportunity?
Yeah, great question. You know, I'll start off by pointing out that a lot of the technologies that you see in the Act today, they were worked on by scientists and engineers and others about, 10 to 20 years ago. So this is how we do this, right? We do the R&D that we need to do. We think about innovative business models. Costs are high. They come down, 10% now compared to 2010, the cost of solar and wind. Or solar and batteries. So, this is the model that we use. And so now you should be sitting there thinking, okay, great, I'm going to do things in my own house, or I'm going to have the impact I can have. But then as a scientist or engineer, and others too, how can I affect it so that, this Act only takes us essentially through 2030. We got to be thinking beyond to 2050. What are the innovations we need? Right? And there are a slew of them out there. There's great advancements in advanced geothermal, also in nuclear, and hydrogen is a big area, in the role of artificial intelligence and data analytics, right? All of these R&D type technologies that you're learning about in your classes, right? That faculty are working on in their labs, right? Those are going to be instrumental to getting us to 2050. So I would say in terms of what, if you're interested in this and being part of this moving forward, particularly the innovation piece, it's really important, and this kind of goes along with the Dartmouth way, right, is that we take a very holistic approach to thinking about those innovations. That we're really understanding early on, what is it going to take for that innovative business model to work, or to manufacture that material that actually is very rare and maybe hard to get and hard to manufacture, right? What are the potential unintended consequences of machine learning and artificial intelligence embedded throughout our energy system? Right? This holistic approach takes not only scientists and engineers, but takes people who understand anthropology and economics. Even, remember how ugly, you guys probably don't remember how ugly thermostats were, but they're kind of cool looking now. So it even takes the artistic piece and having people thinking about design. So a very human-centered approach to the solutions of tomorrow. So I think everybody with any interest can get involved in this from various angles.
Awesome, thank you. Moving or pivoting rather to the environmental perspective, Professor Osterberg, Professor Sundaram talked about monitoring the progress of some of the carbon cost and pricing aspects of this bill in the future. Professor Abramson just talked about having a longer time horizon perspective on the Inflation Reduction Act. How will we continue to monitor the progress and assess the trajectories that we're on in terms of emissions after passing IRA?
Yeah, I think some other folks here can answer that as well too. I mean, you brought up this point, right? Like making sure that we are actually being honest about our emissions, and in particular, I think about our negative emissions, right? Like forest sequestration and things like this that companies are using now in their net zero targets out to 2050, a lot of those are pretty suspicious. There's a lot of really good investigative reporting that's been done since 2018. And then now the SEC is on this even, right? There are new laws that are coming down that are going to require corporations to be monitoring and reporting publicly their Scope 1 and their Scope 2 emissions. And then I think these sort of carbon credits that you get from reforestation or forest management practices, those are going to get a lot more scrutiny, and rightfully so. I think this really great point about the cost of carbon, right? That it gets down to about $75 a ton. That's probably what the fair market value is, according to, there's a great article about actually a Dartmouth alum, he runs Lime Timber. He was saying, we're selling these things for like $12 a ton right now. They're probably worth about $75 a ton. That's probably the true market price. If you actually want to tell, for example, a forester, don't log these trees, right? So there's a lot to be done, I think, on this. And I think you're starting to see it, but I feel like, and I wonder if my other panelists agree, like I feel like we're right on the cusp of recognizing, okay, now that these laws have been passed, not just in America, but in other countries ahead of us, we have to do a much better job of actually monitoring and keeping companies and individuals accountable for how much carbon they're actually putting out there. And we've got scientific ways of doing that. I'm not an expert on that, but I think the public engagement on that, the public scrutiny, making that information not just publicly accessible, but understandable to shareholders, to investment analysts and such. These are really important things that I think we're just about to see a real explosion and good progress on. At least I'm hopeful, because we need it. We need a lot of progress there.
Super, thank you. I think I'll pass it back to John now for our next question.
Sure, yeah, and this one goes to Professor Keller. A lot of your work focuses on risk mitigation strategies, and I think a lot of that has to do with looking into the future, doing cost-benefit analysis and trying to figure out, is this investment worth it versus should we do something more akin to adaptation? And so I think, a lot of this conversation can often get focused in the commercial opportunity, but I'm curious from that more holistic defensive opportunities, we were talking about a broader perspective. How do you think about this setting up those risk cost-benefit decisions for communities and countries as well? Thank you.
I think there's several aspects and layers and scales of risk analysis here. One is a global scale. If every country were to do that, would we be safe? And the answer is no, unfortunately not. This is a risk reduction, but there is no safety in this case. Even if every country were to be successful in doing that, we would have maybe a 50-50 chance to stay below 2 degrees Celsius, and there's no bright red line to go. So this is more like how to manage hard risk in other cases. There is no safety issue. Many people argue we should do more, and other people recognize that it's really hard to do more, and even to do what we aspire to is hard. So on a global scale, I think the mitigation part it does pass a cost-benefit test. The social cost of carbon, by most estimate, is higher than the marginal cost, even calculated by you. So I think, yes, it makes sense it passes the circular A4 check mark on cost-benefit reasoning, with those caveats. On a regional scale, I think one of the things which are missing is how to adapt, because the benefits of this act are going to be decades, centuries in the future, which is great. I have one child. I would like other children are there, so we would like to free for the future. But impacts are being felt right now. There is a lot of investment in how to be resilient and mitigate local climate risk and adaptation. But in the pie chart you have, this was, I guess, in the different other stuff motivation. I think it's 9 billion, which is small compared to that. And that is something which, in my view, is urgently needed. And in terms of, this brings us to the third risk management perspective, which is maybe the opportunities for students, coming back to the previous Team Abramson's question. We see that shift happens, which is great, and we have change. But it also means that the professional environment you have is changing really fast. And the question is, what are the skills that make you nimble in a situation like this? And look at this panel. It's not just people from the business school or science or engineering. It needs at least those disciplines and more. And I think that is maybe a personal risk management or a way to have a portfolio of education that you can be nimble in those complex wicked problems.
Super. Thank you, Professor Keller. For Professor Osterberg, speaking again perhaps about the future and about forecasting, whenever we think about climate models that are currently employed today, and perhaps also carbon accounting models that are currently employed today, what in your mind are the key uncertainties that we're facing right now in these models, and what in terms of the construction of these models do you see as big changes that are happening or need to happen in order to move the needle on some of these tracking problems that we've spoken about today?
Yeah, I think Professor Keller's probably got some good things to think about this as well. You know, I'll start by saying that the climate models are really good. The biggest uncertainties are usually us. Like, what do we do as a society? How many tons of carbon do we emit into the atmosphere and at what rate, right? Those are the biggest uncertainties. If you know exactly how much CO2 is going to be in the atmosphere through time, then the biggest climate uncertainties, I would say, come down to some pretty weedy things about clouds and how much like clouds cool the Earth and how like they're going to respond to warming and also how they respond to pollution in the atmosphere and stuff like that. So what I tell my earth scientist grad students who are like really into, you know, understanding earth science and microphysics and stuff, like clouds is a great field to go into if you want to try and make a difference with our climate models. Another one is potentially the rate at which our ice sheets are going to melt. So we know that if you just leave the temperature where it is right now, and you give Antarctica and Greenland enough time, we're looking at probably 22, 25 feet of sea level rise. Like, we know that. What we don't know is how quickly that happens. And if you like bump up to this temperature for a couple decades, or maybe 50 years, like, do you start a process in those ice sheets that you can't stop? In my world, those are sort of the biggest questions that we're trying to answer. We know what we call like the stable result is if you just leave it there, but the transient result of like popping up to these warm temperatures and then hopefully bringing them back down in a century, what does Antarctica do? That's a huge question. We know sea level is going to keep going up no matter what we do. We know it goes faster the more carbon we put up there, but like those details are really important if you're any coastal community around the world.
Awesome, thank you. Maybe also take a second to let Professor Keller speak on his perspective to this question.
Erich, there's a great comment. Let me just amplify a little bit. And the answer, maybe not surprising for an academic, it depends. And it's interesting in interesting ways. Because what matters for decisions depends on the decision at hand. If you think about setting a carbon price, then climate sensitivity clouds is really important. If you think about pouring concrete to protect New Orleans, it's mostly how people move behind levees and what our storm surges are going to do. And those are very different cases. If you want to think about how do we protect ecosystem for biodiversity, then it's actually the long time scale of ice sheet responses and how this works. So it really depends on how this works. And what is interesting is that there is no magic answer for the most important uncertainty is X. It really is a case-by-case study, almost where you say, for this decision, here's what's important on the engineering, economic, social side, and Earth system side. And that is on the one hand exciting, and there are people in the audience who work on that. And on the other hand, it also makes it more complicated because there is no one-size-fits-all case. And maybe just one feedback here on what's in the IRA. There's actually an instrument in the IRA about block grants where eligible combinations are use local governments and academic institutions. But there's actually an instrument for, and I think this is really exciting, that now in the past, it was always, oh, we do a study paid by NSF, and then when people want to implement it, they say, well, we have no money from NSF, we can't do this. Now we can say, the pre-design, the academic research and design can be done in one stream, which I find actually maybe one of the biggest ones, even though it's just in the small gray bars of complicated other stuff. Sorry, I couldn't resist.
That's excellent. One thing I wanted to kind of touch on moving from the scientific environmental uncertainties is to the business uncertainties. And so I think one of the questions we got from one of our audience members beforehand is how do uncertainties in the market like inflation going on right now, supply chain distributions, how do we think that is going to affect businesses being able to deploy alongside, some of these forecasts? And so, Professor Sundaram, I'm curious what your take is on whether you think those kind of commercial uncertainties matter, or are there other ones that are more important?
Businesses deal with commercial uncertainties all the time, and inflation will come and go. I mean, the 10% world that we're facing now is not a permanent thing. And supply chain issues, there are really no longer term issues. I mean, it just the last 2 or 3 years just screwed up so many things in so many ways. And all that stuff will settle down, and I think thinking about a longer horizon is important. I mean, to me, the bigger issue here is, because incidentally, I mean, a lot of subsidies here will invite businesses to start moving to their production to the US, especially in things like storage. So for example, Tesla basically announced that they're freezing their battery plant building in Germany, and they're going to build one. And incidentally, it could be anywhere in North America, it turns out, where many of the subsidies could apply. So it doesn't have to be in the US per se. It's an NAFTA group of countries, the North American Free Trade Agreement group of countries, I think would qualify for some of it. So we shouldn't forget that, so business investment on top of these subsidies will amplify the impact. There's no doubt about that. And businesses are, investing these dollars with 10 to 15 to 20-year time horizons, not a couple of years of time horizons. I come back to the point about we have to, I hope somebody is seriously thinking about holding the spending, or businesses accountable for the spending. To me, 350 billion here, 550 billion there, $1 trillion for, it adds up, and money is never free. There's always an opportunity cost. Let me give you an example. I mean, some people might say, look, instead of spending, I mean, this is just a sort of, think of it as a slightly, slimmed down version of a $550 billion Build Back Better climate bill that went nowhere. So, but that bill also included spending for childcare. Anybody discussing, would spending 1/5 of what we're spending on this, $350 to $400 billion on improving childcare, maybe solve many other problems? In other words, trade-offs, opportunity costs seem to be missing. We damn well hold people responsible for all this spending that we're doing, and I'm a little skeptical it's going to happen when we see how the PPP money, during the pandemic, etc., hundreds of billions down the toilet. Yes.
That's great, and we could talk about this all day if we wanted to. I know some people have a hard constraint that they need to leave in about 5 minutes, so I want to open it up to our audience here for the next 10 minutes to ask any questions. We have some pre-filtered ones here as well, but we'll just go around, and the mics in this room aren't perfectly set up yet, so if you're willing to stand up and just speak very loudly, we'll start in the back there and then move over there.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I was wondering if you could speak a bit about equity. I didn't hear too much about that. Just maybe for a primer, I have a little experience working on energy transitions in cities, and there's a gap that I haven't seen addressed at least 3 years ago, where low-income households are usually renters, or their buildings don't have the ability to accommodate the technology that is being subsidized. So that's just one example, and I didn't read the bill. So I was wondering if you could talk more broadly about those kinds of issues. Are there specific levers or instruments for addressing this, or is it more of like we're dealing with equity, just don't ask us how?
If Dean Abramson, that might be right up your alley.
Yeah, well, I will give you a general answer and say it would have been nice to do more. But I'll talk, you mentioned the building sides with the landlord-tenant problem that often we run into. I don't believe is specifically addressed in the bill. But what I had never really seen before are both their federal tax credits and their state rebate programs. And so the federal money is the federal government is giving money to the states to run their own rebate programs. And to qualify for this money that goes from replacing windows and insulation and new appliances and heat pumps, right, and even $150 for an energy audit, right, to qualify for those, it's sort of a sliding scale. You can get more of the tax credit, of the rebate. You can qualify for a greater dollar amount if you're at a medium to low income kind of range. So it's just been great to see that thought was put into it. I was around the Obama administration when the stimulus package was used. And I think there was an intention there to think about equity, but it wasn't as well thought out. So we kind of have some great lessons learned from that we now see in the bill in particular. And then on the sort of the power plant side, for example, right? We want to be able to either shut down fossil fuel plants or we want to use carbon capture technologies at fossil fuel plants because both of those things will have a huge impact on air pollution, right? And on the resulting health. And most of those power plants, right, or fossil fuel burning industrial plants are in areas that disproportionately affect disadvantaged communities. And so a real emphasis in the bill on let's get as much fossil fuels out of the equation as possible, and let's think about this deliberately from an equity standpoint and incentivize even more to get the fossil fuels out in those places where they're impacting those communities. So from my standpoint, it was a good step in the right direction.
Can I just, I just want to add two things. So on the air pollution side of things, right, people might not know, like 200,000 Americans die prematurely every year from air pollution. And as Dean Abramson said, it's disproportionately marginalized communities who live very close, not just to power plants, but to the industrial sector as well. And one thing that the IRA does is some of these technologies aren't just going to the electricity industry, the power plants, but also to the heavy industry, the smelting. So that's really good. And one other thing that just jumped at me thinking about your comment about renters, it doesn't translate directly, but it was an improvement on the EV tax credits that you can get a tax credit now for a used EV, which in the past, I think a new EV, the median price is over $50K. So that priced out a huge portion of the population. But now more people will have access to used EVs now that they're becoming more widely popular, and you'll have access to those tax credits.
Can I just, it's a very good question about energy justice. And you'd think that in a business school we don't think about those sorts of issues. We actually do a lot.
You're right.
Yeah, ultimately it's all a social compact, and businesses that fail to meet some of those basic tests will have a tough time surviving or growing. But to me, the biggest energy justice issue worldwide is energy poverty, i.e. lack of access to affordable, reliable, modern sources of energy. There's 1.5 billion people impacted by that, by the way, mostly women, and it's not all in sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia or places like that. There are tens, if not hundreds of millions of people in Western Europe, in the US, and disadvantaged communities who face serious issues of energy poverty. And while, again, I echo Alexis' viewpoint, this is a good start. Yeah, there are some block grants for energy efficiency and, used EVs and so forth. I just wish that the broader issue of energy justice was more clearly defined, or at least what is the framework you're using, and some serious investments in making reliable, affordable energy that is simultaneously also safe and clean, which, by the way, this bill does. So there's a lot of, but somehow, making that being brought to the door of the energy poor people to read would have been a far more direct way to deal with energy justice moving forward.
excellent question and responses there. I know a few of our panelists have to leave, so I want to give you time to go ahead and go if you've got to get out. But next question up there in the corner.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate hearing all these perspectives that have framed this as a tech problem, as a data problem, as a design problem. And we're here to talk about an act that was a political product of 50 years of delay and investment in shutting down all of the things y'all are talking about by the energy companies themselves. And yet I feel like we're entering into some dangerous territory to act like finally Congress got off its butt and did something, when in fact we know full well that energy companies spent $200 million per year lobbying against every single aspect of this bill that y'all are patting on its back now. And that it was a $359 billion price tag on this whole package. The fossil fuel companies get $370 billion of subsidy per year globally. And these are from Forbes and the OECD and the IMF. So can I ask you to address this as a political problem that is created by the industries that we seem now to be turning to as though they are best placed to help us get out of the problem they knew in the early 1970s? Forget risk, forget uncertainties. They knew for certain was exactly where we would be today. The low-tech answer that doesn't require an energy institute or an engineering building to fighting the 1.5 degree Celsius change is leave the oil in the ground, says the IPCC, yes? That if we don't leave 80% of proven reserves in the ground, we will not make it to the 1.5 degree goal for 2050. How is this a design problem?
We were going to talk about politics with one of our panelists who unfortunately wasn't able to join us. And one of the things we were going to talk about there was how by focusing this bill as a stimulus package, it really creates businesses and communities to actually be stakeholders in the energy transition, so they will lobby and advocate for advancement into the future, which will make this more sustained.
And it was these industries that shut it down. So I guess.
Can I make something important? I really feel strongly about it. I'm not about the politics of it. Oh, yeah. But I'm not questioning, I mean, we could go back and forth on the numbers, but that's pointless. I think we should consider the fact that energy companies, such as they have been, Watts and all, I'd be the first to say that none of them, or many of them, haven't been saints. But let's also not ignore the fact that in the last 150 years, their existence and growth has meant that life isn't nasty, brutal, and short anymore. So I think we've got to weigh the pros and cons. I dare anybody here today to live without the benefit of what the energy companies do for us.
And I think we'll try to use the last 5 minutes for another question here, but we're happy to talk more afterwards. Any other? Yep.
Yeah, I was wondering if you guys could talk about kind of some of these nascent tech investments going on, maybe like direct carbon capture and other negative carbon kind of initiatives, because the green energy is kind of proven, storage maybe a little mixed, but you know, some of you alluded to how to store 10+ billion tons of carbon a year. Like, where do you see that tech the next 5 to 10 years going? What do you think might happen? Yeah.
Great question. You could, I think it's interesting to ask the question how the current price structure picks winners in itself. And because, you know, there are potentially direct air capture is right now much more expensive than biofuels and carbon capture and storage. And the question is, in a portfolio, would you like to have both? Would you like to have a price structure? So the policy design of how you choose the price and subsidies may actually advantage, disadvantage things such as direct air capture or potential transformative cases. So I think that's one of the issues. Then arguing against myself here, it's unclear whether the wild assumptions that sometimes have to be made in the IPC scenarios about the availability of carbon capture and storage actually are there. And so it's a very hard decision problem to say, where should we put our admittedly large but still limited portfolio to say, where do we go? And by writing an act which is 200+ pages long, you do make choices. And I think it's very representative of you to say, those choices have consequences for the portfolio, which we will see at the end.
Just a quick reaction. I mean, for the first time, though, I mean, I think there's a recognition that nature-based solutions, whether it's tree planting or tall grass planting or avoided deforestation or reforestation, all that stuff, or more importantly, things, soil carbon restoration technologies, etc. There's a whole bunch of so-called nature-based solutions that are still very early in the game. And I'm actually optimistic. That's one of the areas where I'm optimistic about the bill, that those technologies could get a major filling from the Act. Because you really, to find these things in scale, you have to look to nature-based ways to suck up the carbon and keep it there. So I'm a little, if I interpreted what Klaus said correctly, a little more optimistic than Klaus is on the carbon capture front in this. And by for the first time, a climate discussion actually talks about agriculture, forestry, nature-based solutions. There are all these acronyms and BECS and BECCS. We could go on about it, but I'm a little optimistic on that front. Direct air capture technologies. Yeah.
We'll take one last question if anyone has any. Sure, in the front.
I know that there have been some issues in the past of bills having unintended consequences. I noticed, I recently worked some in hydrogen, and I noticed that there was a $3 per kilogram subsidy, which, based on the low cost of hydrogen, which is, I think, maybe relatively close to reality, could mean that it actually, you'd be being paid to produce hydrogen whether or not you sell it in the near future. Meaning that if things are designed poorly, you could just make it, burn it, get money, that doesn't obviously is a negative outcome. So I'm wondering if there are any things in this bill that we can watch out for that might have those unintended consequences upcoming, and that we're saying, okay, this should be something to look at.
The short answer is, I bet there are. There will be surprises. Let me just, thinking loud here. If you throw money at a problem and you move fast, you don't just break things, you set things in stone, literally. And whether this is a smart move with fast speed is a problem. There's a trade-off. Going too slow is bad, going too fast is bad. But certainly going fast without careful planning is maybe not the smartest way to go. And so I'm a little bit concerned about this as one unintended consequence. Maybe I'm biased because it's what I work on. So I see there are problems where there may be none, but I think, yes, I'm pretty sure there are.
Okay. Great, and I know we're at time now, so I wanted to thank everyone for coming here. Especially thank you to all the panelists, and as you can tell, this is a very complicated bill, so hopefully keep the conversations going and keep asking questions.